Good evening. My name is Heather Barta, and I am the coordinator of Province 5. And I want to welcome you tonight to this exciting event that we're having. I will let Marcia tell you more about that in a second. It is my job to introduce myself in Province 5. So as the coordinator, it's my job to help with networking and connecting people within the province and across the church so that you can do the ministries that you're called to do wherever you serve. So I know that the pandemic has made us pretty good at Zoom, but I would like to remind you that please keep yourself muted unless you have a question. Also, please feel free to open up your chat bar. So if you look around along the bottom, you can hit the little chat box. And then if you have questions throughout the event or would like to share something, you can put it there. I'll be tracking questions that will come up at the question time, but feel free to use the chat. So that is available to you. You might want to use speaker view in your upper right-hand corner. If you're on a computer, it says view, and you can choose gallery or speaker, and you'll want to choose speaker, and then the highlight, I'll have a spotlight. So I'm on spotlight right now. So if you choose speaker view, you should see me biggest. We are recording this for this evening. So as the coordinator of Province 5, again, I welcome you to this event. We are thrilled that one of the networks that has formed within our province is the Public Theology Network. And so the Reverend Dr. Marcia Ledford is the convener of that. And I will turn this all over to her to get us started.
Hi, everybody. What a pleasure it is to be here. And I was supposed to remind Heather to start the recording. And even though she did, I wanted to be sure and fulfill my task. So there. Now we are recording. And I would like to ask that we unmute everybody because I'm going to pray us in. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatred cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
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 Marcia? I'm not hearing her.
You need to unmute yourself, Marcia.
You all are going to learn over the next 4 weeks that my Zoom skills are wanting. This started as an opportunity through the big provincial gathering, which Heather and Jenny Callard gathered together under the auspices of the Province 5 board. And a bunch of Episcopalians from Province 5 converged on the poor little town of Kalamazoo, and it's never been the same since. And at that time, I did a workshop on political theology, and it was one of the highest registered workshops. And I don't say that out of a place of pride necessarily, but there was a lot of interest, and it told us that we need to be more hands-on in the public square with our progressive and inclusive message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so over this past several months, I've been working with Heather. As she mentioned, the Public Theology Network emerged. We started meeting in March, and we have a group of about 12 intrepid souls who get together and talk about how we can help our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ to work for a more just society. And boy, do we need that. So I'm going to give you a term, political theology, and I want you to memorize this definition. It's very easy. Political theology is speaking our faith in public. to as broad an audience as we can. Speaking our faith in public, lots of people, if we can. Okay, say it back with me. Speaking our faith in public to as many people as we can. Excellent. It's very simple. So, and notice that it's not speaking Christianity in the public square. It's speaking our faith, whatever they might be. It might be Islam. It might be Judaism. It might be Hinduism. Whatever it is. So many of the world's religion have a common golden rule, like we have: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's where the coalition building starts. So at this point, I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Alan Yarborough. We are very lucky to have this fellow. He's just a fine, fine fellow, and he knows a lot, and we're going to learn a lot. He is the Church Relations Officer of the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations. He helps manage their grassroots advocacy engagement and develops resources aimed at educating and equipping the church in public advocacy. Prior to this, he lived and worked in Haiti with the Young Adult Service Corps, working in economic development, communication, and project management. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Clemson University in South Carolina, and is currently getting his master's in conflict analysis and resolution at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Alan, we're just delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Marcia. I really appreciate that introduction, and it's wonderful to be with you all today to talk about how to be an advocate, how to carry forward our work as Episcopalians into the public square in a number of ways. And to do this, in the midst of an election, I think requires some broadening of our context. So while I am speaking to, or will speak to, some election engagement work, that's not the only piece that I'm thinking about when I'm presenting the material today. I hope to speak to you all for maybe 30 to 40 minutes. This is a little bit of a new slideshow I've got, so I'm not 100% certain how long it'll take me to go through it, but I want to leave time for questions at the end. If you don't mind, just enter your questions into the chat box. If you have them as we go, I may see them and respond in the moment, if that makes sense, or I may just save it until the end, just kind of depending on the flow of the conversation. To get started, I'm going to share my screen, and you should be able to see the U.S. Capitol there. And I want to start speaking to you all today from the perspective of hope. It's a message that I was using in January and February of 2020, and then I stopped using it, and I regret that I stopped using it because it's still such an important message, and I think it's central to our faith, that's central to being a follower of Jesus, to have hope. And I ultimately think engaging in public policy advocacy, casting our vote in an election, helping to build stronger communities, it's about building a foundation for our common life together. And there's a lot of hope in that. There's a lot of opportunity that we have at our disposal in the US in order to do that. And I hope that through the course of the presentation today and our relationship, that can hopefully continue afterwards, you'll have new tools that you'll be able to use to carry forward with that work. And, we heard, what is advocacy? And over the course of my points, I'll start to unpack the definition of it, but it's very similar to lobbying, although legally there are distinctions, and it has a lot to do with relationship building, a lot to do with representing the church's values, but it's focused primarily on legislation and policy making. And so I want to start actually by putting that in the context maybe of a lot of the other political work that we have seen this summer that's been going on in the protests for Black Lives Matter and other initiatives across the country. President Barack Obama had a really great op-ed that spoke to public engagement. He wrote a couple of months ago, sort of as a response, or his response to the protests following George Floyd's death. And in that, he talks about two parallel means of engagement. One is this awareness building, this energy building that happens in the form of these protests that is critical. It's important to raise awareness. It's important to educate other people, to have platforms where people's voices are heard. But he articulated the second parallel path in this way. He said, eventually, aspirations, which are often expressed in protest or can be, aspirations have to be translated into specific laws and institutional practices. And in a democracy, that only happens when we elect government officials who are responsive to our demands. And so this is where advocacy comes in. It's about relationship building with those officials who are in leadership positions in our government, to influence them, to hold them accountable once they are elected into office, and to also be there as a resource for them, bringing the resources of the church into those conversations in ways that can hopefully help us all address injustices and inequality in not only our community, but internationally as well. And I'll speak to that momentarily. So in person, I love doing in-person presentations. I'm sorry that we're unable to do that in the current climate, but so I want you to take just a moment to reflect on why we might do this work. Why would we engage in advocacy as Episcopalians? Why would we engage in advocacy as a church? And just kind of think of maybe of one or two reasons. Maybe you already engage in this work. Think about why you already are engaging in advocacy. If you want, you can mention your answers in the chat box as I move forward. And a lot of answers that people come up with are often, our faith informs us it's to care for others. We have our voice, and sometimes others' voices are silenced. So how do we use ours to speak out on their behalf? But there are three particular reasons that I want to highlight or add to the ones you all may be coming up with. And the first is Scripture. Scripture explicitly calls us to use our voice to speak out in the public square. We like to use this passage from Proverbs: speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of the destitute, speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. And there are a number of places in the Bible, from the Gospels to the Old Testament, that talk about this type of public engagement. And so it is very much grounded in our faith just as much as sort of more tangible outreach may be, like working in a soup kitchen, a homeless ministry, community garden, that sort of thing. The second reason I want to mention is scale. So why do we advocate to the government? It's because the scale of impact that the government has, especially the federal government, is far larger than what we can have on our own. That's not to say we should stop doing the other things that we're doing, the other ministries that we have. There's good work being done there. But to amplify our impact, we really have to start influencing legislation and getting involved in advocacy. As one example, just 5% of US domestic food assistance comes from charitable organizations. So that's all churches, that's all faith groups, all secular nonprofits. And the other 95% of that funding comes from the federal government. So if we really want to be involved in addressing hunger in the US, we've got to be involved with a say in legislation that can address that problem. The third example, which is probably third reason, is probably my favorite, and that is the authority that the government has that no other entity has. So in other words, if we want to have particular influence in certain spaces, we're required or have to have some sort of interface with the government in order to do so. Three examples, although there are many others that are up here, include immigration and refugee resettlement, foreign policy, and environmental regulation. So if we as a church want to be engaged in creation care, if we want to continue the ministry of Episcopal migration ministries, resettling refugees in the US, we have to be involved in advocating to the federal government to do those things, because it's the federal government that has the authority to allow refugees in the first place. Same thing with foreign. If we want to have a say on the US foreign policy, we've got to be engaging with the government. So that's a bit about why we engage in advocacy. I'm trying to get the chat box up so I can see your questions. There we go. in your comments. Wonderful. Use your anger for good. As a person of color, some communities, our lives depend on it. Absolutely. Yep. These are very real issues that impact people directly. And even if they don't impact you, perhaps they're impacting other people in our church, other people in our community. So I want to sort of stop for a moment and give kind of the company line, if you will, for the Office of Government Relations and those who may not be familiar with it. So it's a part of the church-wide staff or the presiding bishop staff, which is based in New York City. However, we are physically located in Washington, D.C., and we're tasked with representing the policy positions of the Episcopal Church to the U.S. federal government. And those policy positions, we do not create them ourselves. They come up through the bicameral legislature of the Episcopal Church, which is known as General Convention, or Executive Council. So the elected bodies within the church are the ones that create the drafts of these resolutions. They deliberate over them and then ultimately have to pass them in order for them to become our policies that we represent, which is a really important part of our work. It means we're not just sort of off on our own. We're actually representing what the church has spoken out on and how, and then trying to deliver that message and those values to the U.S. government, even and maybe especially when the government's not even necessarily focused on that particular issue. As a part of this work, we invite all Episcopalians to join the Episcopal Public Policy Network, which is our grassroots network to engage in federal policy advocacy. I hope that you all are able to become a part of that. You can follow us on social media at the EPPN or sign up for our email list, and we'll be sure to get you that information following the webinar. And I think it's already gone out ahead of time as well. And so within the context of this work, General Convention has also explicitly directed us to work with bipartisan efforts in Congress wherever possible, and to intentionally engage with both elected and career government officials from all political parties. So first of all, and especially with our election engagement, our work has to be nonpartisan. And what that means is we cannot support or endorse, or support or denounce a political candidate or party in the context of an election. However, once people are elected, we are essentially using our constitutional right to petition the government and hold them accountable in their role as that elected official. And so to be more effective in this work, knowing that our work is for the long term, it's not just for one presidential administration or one session of Congress, we really want to be intentional in being bipartisan because we think that will lead to it will give us a greater chance of success in the long term by building relationships with all political parties in Congress. One other sort of odd slide. I almost didn't include this one because it works a little bit better in person, but I hope you all, or if you all don't understand like the 115th Congress, a Congress is the session of 2 years in between elections that the Congress meets. So for the 115th Congress, that was the previous full session of Congress that we have had. It was 2016 through 2018. We're currently in the 116th Congress, although of course that will come to an end very soon. And Congress will switch over early in 2021 for the 117th session of Congress. So in those 2 years of the 115th Congress, how many bills do you think were introduced? How many pieces of legislation were introduced in Congress? Any guesses? Again, you can use your chat box here. Okay, 5,250, 3425. Okay, so it's actually not as low. Some of those aren't as low as I've seen. However, the number was 13,556. So it's just an extraordinary number of pieces of legislation that were introduced in a 2-year time span only in the US Congress. So this isn't even looking at state governments. How many of those bills were voted on? Only 867, or 6%. And that's just the ones that received the vote. That doesn't mean that they all passed. So how many were enacted into law? 443, or 3% of the pieces of legislation that were introduced. So part of this is to highlight just the complexity of the environment that is within Congress. And while Congress certainly frustrates me, and they are, I think, more this summer perhaps than ever, I also have a lot of sympathy for them in terms of the sheer number of issues that they have to cover and address. Within that, I also want to highlight in our advocacy, some people often write sort of discouraged because the members that represent them, their senators and their member in the House of Representatives, are generally in agreement with them. That may be great. You can thank them for their engagement. You can thank them for their actions, but it is still helpful for you to reach out on issues that matter to you, because it can help them prioritize and sort through all of these different bills, all of these different issues that they're looking at. And I also raise this to essentially say this is a great reason to have the Office of Government Relations, and is one of the value adds that we bring to add for Episcopal advocates across the country. Our staff are working in this environment. We're working in coalition with other faith-based advocacy offices and secular ones as well, navigating this complex landscape and figuring out, okay, when is the right time to actually push for a vote? Is something going to move forward or not? Is there another bill or an alternative that seems to have a better chance, and why? And would we maybe want to compromise for that or push for that bill instead? And sometimes legislators actually reach out to us and ask for input on bill drafts, asking for expertise and that sort of thing. I think a question if we should begin with local issues. I'll come back to that, Jim, in the Q&A. It's a good question. So what are all of these areas that, in all these areas, what does the Episcopal Church look at? We have policies on dozens and dozens of things. And so ultimately we've got to prioritize on something and focus in some way based on the interests of Episcopalians, based on where we think we can have a unique voice and be influential in our work in DC. Sort of the policy areas that we focus on most are creation care, ending poverty, which is both domestic and international, migration, refugees and immigration, and human rights and peace building. The fifth category up there, racial reconciliation, is a little bit unique because it's not necessarily a discrete category of policy, areas. We instead use racial justice, racial healing as like a lens to look at some of the other policy areas rather than thinking of it as a totally separate thing in and of itself. So what that means in practice is, if we're looking at pollution regulation or immigration policy, what are the racial justice implications of those policies or those pieces of legislation? The example I like to use lately is one that I think highlights the importance of doing that, because it's a really peculiar example. So we've been pushing for another stimulus package in response to COVID-19 and the economic downturn. And one piece that we're continuing to highlight in that is federal funding for state and local governments, since state budgets are being hit so hard in the coronavirus response and with unemployment. The reason why, or one of the many reasons why that's a racial justice issue, is because state governments disproportionately employ Black and other non-white Americans. And so the concern is when those budgets, when that sort of crisis hits ahead, there are going to be layoffs, and that will disproportionately impact non-white people. So it's going to be a matter of racial justice to try to keep state budgets afloat and state governments afloat. So that's sort of a rhyme or reason, or how we apply that across these issues. It's not perfect. It's something we're constantly trying to improve, but we hope that that's the helpful perspective, especially in an environment where legislation is not explicitly race-based, but can sometimes very much have implicit implications based on race. So this is sort of another way to look at the work of OGR, and a lot of it, is public, but the vast majority of our work is spent below the surface. It's not necessarily seen. I mentioned some of these things already in terms of legislators asking us for expertise. We'll contribute to bill drafts. We track legislation. So this is the stuff that kind of we sort through, and then once we send something out into the public, whether that's an Episcopal Church statement or a call to action that we send to all Episcopalians asking you all to advocate on a bill, all of that, is sort of the public piece that comes out of this work. So there's this synergy here of all of these pieces. I've also done more specific trainings in policy advocacy that dig into these more, looking at them as different tools that you may be able to use in your own context. I've done that more for like lay and ordained church leaders, and happy to have a follow-up conversation with any of you if you're interested in doing that type of work. So again, make sure to join the Episcopal Public Policy Network, and you'll get updates like these action alerts, which we send roughly once a week, although we've been a little more active lately. We try not to send out too many to overwhelm folks, but they're, again, all informed by church policy and official positions. We try to have educational resources to accompany them without them being too overwhelming. But they're sent in a way that is strategic, either with coalitions that we're working in and other partners, or based on the environment and the read that we're getting on Capitol Hill in DC to see, okay, now is the moment for action on supporting human rights defenders, for example, or now is the time for action on the 2020 census and moving the timeline for when the Census Bureau can deliver the data to the president. That's something that is currently on the table in the census. We'll also, through the EPPN, send out advocacy campaigns because we view a piece of advocacy as just education on the issues that we're covering, education on issues that are facing our community to make sure people understand different angles to it, different parts of the process. Sometimes it involves, analyzing compromise and why a particular bill works in a given moment, and comparing that to other church policies that we have. The 2020 census was that series highlighted the importance of the census process to essentially all of the other advocacy work that we do. The census is not just about the apportionment process of congressional seats, but it's about the data that federal agencies use, that state governments use, local governments use, in order to develop their programming for the next 10 years. So that's a great tool or source of educational material, we hope, as well. And so hopefully that is another reason to sign up for our email list. I do want to specifically sort of take a little bit of a detour and a deeper dive into our international advocacy for a couple of reasons. First of all, as people within the US, we have, whether we use it or not, a relatively high level of power and influence on international issues, given the United States presence abroad. Our foreign policy impacts almost every country on earth, and we are able, hopefully through our advocacy on foreign policy issues, to influence that in a positive way, more than people in other countries are. Additionally, the Episcopal Church, of course, I've talked about our advocacy to the US federal government. The Episcopal Church itself is in 17 different nations. And then as a whole, we're one of 41 provinces now, I think, in the worldwide Anglican Communion. And so we're able to build and draw on those relationships and this advocacy as well, which is something that not a lot of other organizations can do. The Catholic Church is able to do that. And we do work with the Catholics extensively on international issues, but it's something that's really, really unique to our Episcopal identity. And we hope to sort of guide our advocacy in the space, in the international policy space, in a way that's helpful. So I really encourage you to pay attention to that. It usually is not something that's front page news and in the headlines, but it's something that's really important in an area where we can have real influence, especially compared to other areas. So just a little bit of an aside. Happy to answer questions on that as well. In the last few minutes here, before opening up to questions, I know this is a lot of information. I want to just highlight 4 resources in addition to the EPPN that could hopefully be helpful for you. The first of those is our civil discourse curriculum. So, of course, a part of political engagement is conversation. It's listening. It is voicing our own perspective and point of view. And so how do we do that using civil discourse, which we define as conversation to enhance understanding? It's a very particular angle on civil discourse and distinguishes it from civility, which is a larger and more fraught concept. But this curriculum, it's a video curriculum that we did with Church Next. It's something you can do as individuals. It's something you can do as a group. to explore how we talk to one another. And we hopefully have it set up so that you have, some theological reflection and incorporated into it, some reflection on privilege and identity and experience and how that influences how we talk to one another. Because again, these issues that we speak about, we're not always completely removed from them. There are real people, these issues impact real people. They impact ourselves, they impact our loved ones, people in our pews. And so how do we handle that? How do we build our communal capacity to engage in these conversations? Because I really think that our success and ability to problem solve, to work with legislators and policymakers, it depends on this type of interaction, of leaning in, of getting close, and really digging into some passionate, tough issues. So I encourage you to check that out if you have not done so already. It's sort of a labor of love of mine. I really have enjoyed putting together that curriculum in 2 different versions. That's the first of 4 resources. Next is our election resources. So we have a whole bunch of them, but the one that I want to really highlight is just our Plan Your Vote resource. It's 5 steps, and it just emphasizes the need and importance of planning your vote for the 2020 election, so that you know how you will cast your vote. By that, I do not mean who you'll be voting for. I simply mean the actual process that you will take in order to cast that vote. Because this year, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of states' processes are changing and being modified. There are more opportunities to vote by mail or absentee, depending on which term you want to use. And in some places, early in-person voting is being expanded as well. So making sure you go through this process, making sure you're registered, confirm your registration status, researching who is on your ballot, researching if there are ballot initiatives that are also going to be on your ballot so that you are prepared to know how you wish to cast your vote on those issues. If you want to vote by mail, making sure you do that in time. There are deadlines to both requesting it and then deadlines for filling it out and turning it in. And there are also very specific instructions that you have to follow when filling out that ballot. So be very careful, take your time doing it. And then of course, voting in person is still an option. Voting early, if you can help reduce lines and crowding on election day itself, which is both, one way to reduce the risk of the spread of COVID-19, but it is also a way to reduce lines and the length of time, hopefully, that people have to take to vote on election day. And then 5th, of course, helping other people vote and overcoming the challenges of doing so in a number of ways. We have a lot of resources on that. You can go to the link that's on the screen. It's bit.ly or bit.ly /TEC votes. And again, we've sent and we'll be sending that email out to everyone that's registered for the webinar. 3rd is the US Census. So I spoke about this already. And the programs that use it, but the Episcopal Church is a formal partner for the 2020 census to help the Census Bureau get as accurate a count as possible. Based on a recent court ruling, the Census Bureau is extending their data collection period through the end of October. So you can still advertise this. You can still take the census if you have not done so already. It's critical that you do so that your community counts you. And that can impact the amount of funding that your community gets for a number of programs. So it's not only about you, it's also about your community and making sure that it's taken care of and that the programs that our government implements are more efficient and more effective. Please be on the lookout for further advocacy on this issue as well. There's going to be an issue now that so the deadline for data collection, again, was extended to October 31st, but the data is supposed to be all compiled and then delivered to the president by the end of 2020, so at the end of December. However, they already cut that timeline from 5 months down to 3, and now it is 2 months. So it really is essentially impossible for them to make that deadline without congressionally approved extensions for the deadlines to deliver the data. That's getting into the weeds a bit. It is not in the news at all, but it is really going to be quite challenging to overcome that if it is not addressed imminently. So please do take, that's sort of a very specific request for a more general webinar. But please do pay attention to that. The 2020 census is critical. I would argue it's maybe more important than this election. It only happens every 10 years, and the reach of its impact is just enormous. Fourth and final resource before we move into Q&A is our misinformation, disinformation, why should we care resource. So misinformation, something you may have started to hear about, maybe you're hearing about it more. It's something that's not new, and this resource actually begins with the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden as sort of an old reference to misinformation and deception. So it's not a new problem. It's just simply there are new communication tools, mainly social media, that are facilitating the spread of misinformation in ways that are incredibly harmful. There are also, and the sources vary. It's not just international sources, like what we have seen with Russian interference in our election in 2016 and some in 2018, but there are domestic sources as well. So this resource is meant to help you identify misinformation and work to combat it. It's something that we still have not seen other faith groups engaging on this. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America has just adapted our resource and re-released it as theirs, giving us credit, which is a wonderful collaboration with them. So we're sort of building some momentum around misinformation, but this is something that's critical for across the board for your engagement and advocacy, for your conversations with one another even, and for discerning your vote this year. And how you're going to vote. So we hope that this resource is helpful. We welcome feedback on any of these things. Maybe there are resources I didn't review or that you're not finding, and we can help work with you to develop those. Ultimately, our office is here as a resource for the church to assist you with all of your policy advocacy needs. It's a wonderful, I've had a wonderful experience working with this office. I'm grateful to be in the midst of this election season. And we really, thrive and become more effective in this work the more people who are involved. So I look forward to hopefully beginning a relationship with you all today. I see some familiar names and faces on here on the call that I've interacted with in a number of ways previously. But I'm really, really grateful for your time today. And we'll stop here for Q&A. Marcia, are you going to be kind of taking that over?
This is Heather. So we have two that were in the chat. Okay. The first one was, shouldn't we begin with local issues?
So that's a great question. And, I don't think of it as either beginning with local or national or international. I think of it in a different way. There is almost an infinite number of things that we can take on and engage with. So we have to think where's our interests, what skills do we have, what expertise do we have, and how may we be able to apply that in this work in advocacy, and what relationships do we have, or what relationships can we build, and how do we leverage those for influencing change. So that's more how I think of it, rather than trying to separate it by local, national, or international, because all of those issues ultimately impact one another. So if your parish, your congregation, or ministry has certain outreach programs, that might be a good place to start. Say you have these tangible ministries like a community garden. Reflect on why you have that community garden. Is it to address environmental education? Is it to address food insecurity? And then how might you also pursue those goals through advocacy? How might those ministries, the stories, the experiences of those ministries be useful for a certain level of government? So maybe you're in a town that has a problem with homelessness. How do your relationships with homeless ministries, how might those inform city council members' decisions in addressing homelessness? So that's more how I would think about it. And I hope is how I framed, the international advocacy work that I mentioned in terms of foreign policy. It's really about leveraging a unique aspect of the Episcopal Church overall and applying that to the policy space in DC.
Thanks. The next question was, what happens if the data deadline for census is not extended and is missed?
I have no idea. I don't know. Ultimately, it's a catch-22, and neither option that the Census Bureau is faced with is good. On the one hand, if you cut the data collection short, you risk a more significant undercount than usual, so an inaccurate count. But then you stay on the deadlines. If you miss deadlines, whether that's legally approved or not, that's going to disrupt the redistricting process in 2021 because the states aren't going to receive the data in time in order to do that redistricting. And that can set off a whole bunch of timelines for local and state elections. I think Virginia and New Jersey are the first two to go through that process in 2021. We in our advocacy have decided that it is more harmful to have an inaccurate census count. And so we have advocated for extending those deadlines, but recognize there will still be further work to do in 2021 in certain states to then accommodate those changes. If there is no legal change, though, in delivering the data to the president, I really am not certain what happens.
Thanks. The next question was, do you want to mention the ambassador program?
Yes, I'm wondering if that was Leanne Reed that's on here. I'm not sure. Yeah, so the EPPN ambassador program is something that's new. I think we have at least one on the call, which is great. But the EPPN ambassador program, we're trying to identify people, really one in each diocese, although we have some that have two that coordinate with each other to help amplify our messaging on a parish by parish or ministry by ministry basis. We found there's a significant gap in awareness of our office, and we think we can really improve on our effectiveness by growing our network in that way, by building closer relationships vis-a-vis these ambassadors with parishes across the country. So if you're interested in more information about that or even joining, please do be in touch with me. And I can get you, send you or direct you to the application process for that. It's something that's new. We're modifying it as we go, even though we did have a pilot run last year in 2019. But I'm grateful for the work that's already going into that, and looking forward to seeing where that goes.
Thanks. I'm going to skip Jean's question. I will come back to that. The next question from Phyllis. Alan, what approach would you take for introducing the civil discourse curriculum in a parish that is politically diverse?
First of all, I think it is it's helpful for a politically diverse parish. And part of the inspiration for me creating the curriculum in the first place was to reflect the gift that I've been given in the position I'm in with the church of having to interact with Episcopalians across the political spectrum. Of most mainline denominations in the US, the political affiliation of Episcopal Church membership most closely represents the US public. So it's a fairly diverse church body in terms of like Republican Democrat split. And I think that's an asset. I think that's an opportunity for improving our conversations, for improving engagement across difference, even though of course there are other lines of diversity where we are not as diverse, but politically I think that can be really helpful. That said, not only with our civil discourse program, but with other dialogue programs like Better Angels or Living Room Conversations, it seems to be a consistent problem that people on the right it's not that they are necessarily opposed to them, it just doesn't necessarily catch their eye. They don't seem to participate as often as people on the left. And I think that's a challenge. So having some sort of deliberate mechanism or deliberate invitation to accommodate for that might be helpful. But I've also seen my favorite exercise in the curriculum, and it's actually in the written version, is an exercise that talks about our values and beginning our conversations from a place of values before we jump into partisan positions. And the exercise is a page with a long list of values on it. And you're supposed to, it's something like circle the values that you hold dear, square the values that the church holds dear, and underline the values you think the country holds dear. And of course, there's some overlap with that. And what I have seen over and over again doing that exercise is in audiences that I know are more politically diverse, they come away surprised and learning what they have in common with one another. And audiences that are more politically homogenous, they come away surprised at the differences that they have, the disagreement that they have over what values to emphasize. And I think that's ultimately a part of the goal of the curriculum, is to get people thinking and engaging in a different way and really reflecting on how we're interacting in the context of our conversations. If you want further help with that, again, please do reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to give you further input and guidance on using the curriculum.
A question from Doug. Is it possible to get a list of folks from our diocese or state subscribed to EPPN?
Let's talk about that. I do not know. I have not been asked that before, Bishop Sparks, but let's talk about that. And I can ask Rebecca about that as well. We typically keep that list pretty close at hand. What we have done is so like I did for this webinar, actually, we will send a message to the people in a given state or area and invite them to something or invite them to sign up for further information. But yeah, let's talk about that.
Thanks. Are you connected with the Industrial Areas Foundation and the Poor People's Campaign?
I'm not familiar with the Industrial Areas Foundation. The Episcopal Church is connected to the Poor People's Campaign, though. That's not done through our specific office. It's done through the Department of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care. And so we are sort of an official partner. I don't know what the term is, if it's partner or if we endorse the Poor People's Campaign. I can't remember the word. We're participating in it, but that kind of highlights a little bit of the differences that I talked about in the op-ed from President Obama. So the Poor People's Campaign does get into an advocacy space a little bit, but it's more in sort of the protesting movement space, which again is critical. It works in tandem with this advocacy, but that ultimately isn't where our office's focus is.
Alan, can I interject?
Absolutely.
Okay, so it's a really good question. The Industrial Areas Foundation is sort of the original community organizing training developed by Saul Alinsky, and there are many forms of it. There are also several national faith-based community organizing entities that are in various places around the country, and we'll be talking about that a lot in session 3. We will be joined by Adonis Flores of Michigan United, who is the chief community immigration organizer for Michigan United, and he will be able to talk about the options that we have available. Michigan United is associated with the Michigan Poor People's Campaign, and I'm involved in both of those entities. Michigan, the People's Campaign is a C4, and that's different than a C3, 501c3 charity. So we'll be talking, it's a political action committee. So we'll be talking about those things in more detail in session 3, which is on October 20th. So very good question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marsha, for that, those additions. And in terms of our coalition building, I haven't gone into that a whole lot, but it's a critical part of our advocacy strategy, and Canon should be for your own. I building off of this idea of leaning into sort of what value add can you bring, what specific angle or contribution can you make. Other organizations can bring different things to the table. So for example, we work, so our office is four full-time, 1 half-time staff. It's the smallest it's been since it was created in the late 70s, and is one of the smaller faith-based advocacy offices in DC, whereas the Quakers, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, has like 55 staff. I mean, it's just enormous. And they have 3 people exclusively dedicated to criminal justice reform. So we're able to lean into them and their research, their tracking of legislation, the relationships that they build with members of Congress. We're able to rely on that for our own criminal justice reform advocacy. It doesn't mean that we take on their positions necessarily, but it does mean that we work with them on that. We do the same thing with the Southern Baptist Convention, with the Catholics. I mean, sort of look for any and all partners that we can. So that coalition building is helpful. The main thing that we have to be aware of, though, is to essentially only work with 501c3 organizations and make sure that all of the work that we do is nonpartisan. 501c4 organizations have more leeway in terms of the partisan work that they can do, which you see come forward most apparently.
So, and this underscores the other question about why not start local. One of the ways that you can engage in local activities is to, join a community organizing entity and they work on a lot of local and statewide issues that are very important. And so, but you can also be writing to your congressional representatives and following the Episcopal Public Policy Network alerts and so forth. So it can be sort of a two-pronged approach. And I think that that's an important thing to remember.
Absolutely.
You're in IAF in Cleveland. Is that Gary that said that?
That's Gary, yeah. Hey, Gary.
Yes, I said that. How are you doing, Alan?
Doing well. How are you?
Good.
Can you give a quick example of something you're working on with IAF, Gary?
Well, we're working on several things, but one thing we had a big effect on was overcharging in the criminal justice system. We had 2 meetings when the prosecutors were being elected, were mass meetings where we had 1,000 people in the sanctuary of a temple, and we put out what we wanted them to do, and they've been doing it. We're still overcharging more than any county in the state in Cleveland, Cuyahoga County, but it's dropped a lot. The death penalty cases have dropped a lot. And it's all because we figured out that on the local level, the prosecutor gets to decide how to charge.
I think, Alan, you had a question from Diana. What is?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry. So, Diana, I see one thing can individuals do to help our office achieve its mission. The main thing is to join us in this work. I'll put actually the EPPN sign up link in the chat here. If I can type. There we go. Our sign up link, you can join and get these emails to start tracking our work. I know you may be receiving advocacy emails from other organizations. We hope that ours, are enticing enough, short enough, easy enough to use for you to take action, on a weekly basis with us, or as you feel called to, depending on the issue. But that would be the main way. And there are a number of ways to get more involved from there. But I think, one takeaway from today would be to sign up. We ask for your mailing address. That is in order so that our system can connect you to the proper elected officials. So that when we send a message to you, or when you're filling out the form to send a message to Congress, it's sending it to the right people. So that's why we ask for that much information, but otherwise it's not too intrusive.
And Amy asks, I'm not sure if this is going to be Alan or Marcia. I'm an attorney licensed in federal court. How do I get involved?
That may be more of a Marcia question if you want to.
I just sent a note to Amy and I recommended that she look into lawyers and callers through Sojourners. They do great work and it's a place for priests and lawyers to work together. That is one source. And then there are many ways that you can contribute greatly as an attorney. So why don't you get in touch with me and we'll talk about it some more, Amy.
Fabulous. I am still holding Jean's question. Jean, don't worry, I have it on hold and you'll find out why in a minute. Any other questions tonight? around Alan's presentation, pieces from the Office of Government Relations. Oh, Brad asks, is it worthwhile to write an actual letter to Congress people, or just as good to send 1 or 2 sentence email?
Good question, and I cover that more in a detailed advocacy strategy training. Ultimately, between emails or actual letters, it does not matter. Snail mail is scanned and sent in as a PDF. That's part for congressional security. Although there are situations if you're having like an in-person meeting, which essentially aren't happening because of COVID-19. But thank you, Bishop Sparks. Which essentially aren't happening. But if you're doing in person, bringing letters that people have written in person is something that's acceptable. Whether or not that is better is uncertain. But one thing to keep in mind with this advocacy work is it's about long-term relationship building. Certainly these emails and just getting a volume of calls, a volume of emails sent is helpful. There's value in that. They're going to be recorded. It can help, sway or help getting that feedback from constituents is helpful for legislators. But that said, where the effectiveness increases is when you have storytelling, when you show you're more proactive in your engagement with a given elected official or even members of their staff. So our office, the staff in our office and myself, more often than not, we're meeting with staff members of congressional offices, not with the members themselves. And they have subject matter expertise. They report to their boss every single day. And those are often the people that you really want to build a relationship with. And that can happen over time, even by sending multiple emails and letters. I hope that's helpful without getting too much into the weeds there, but it's a great question. And I think helpful to always think about, what is actually effective here. But sending letters, sending emails is a good way of engagement.
So Alan, how hard is it to get you to do a more in-depth advocacy training?
In 2021, it'll be a whole lot easier.
Okay, very good.
Between now and the end of the year, it's a little bit hectic.
A show of hands in the chat box. Who would like to do a more advanced training, just as a very informal survey? So
there you go.
There you go. All right. So.
Okay. Any other questions? Because I'm still holding Jean's question because you're asking the leading question, Jean. So anything else for Alan tonight? Okay. Alan, I appreciate your help. I'm going to switch to Marcia because really this question is hers. So here we go. Jean would like to know, are there boundaries around advocacy work at the parish level in terms of 501c3 status?
Well, yes, indeed, there are. However, and we'll talk about, I'm going to answer that a little bit now. But session 3 is going to be when we get into the nitty-gritty of what charities, 501c3 organizations can and cannot do. And largely, not completely, it has to do around election cycles and the endorsement of candidates. We are not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to tell people how to vote. We can tell them physically, mechanically, how to get to the polls and so on, but we can't tell people what candidate to select. So in terms of advocating around issues, we have a lot more latitude than what a lot of people think. We are a nation that, the First Amendment was called the Great Experiment, the Great American Experiment by James Madison, who was the primary architect of the Bill of Rights. And Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter about the wall of separation between church and state. And all of a sudden, I think people thought that was kind of gospel. And it's not. So we're going to get into that a whole lot more in session 3. We're going to talk about what we can and can't do and how we can effectively use our First Amendment guarantees of free exercise and free speech, the right to gather and petition, to voice our faith-based concerns. So I hope that'll encourage you to join us that day, Jean, and we'll get to it. I would like to ask another question that you can put your answer in the chat box. Would you be interested in joining a private Facebook group where we can get together after our sessions and talk about issues that we are facing? Political theology issues that we would like to address, but we don't know who to talk to, because we want to really equip you for ministry, and we want you to teach us what you need. So we're going to put a Facebook link in the chat box. I see some people don't use Facebook, and we are using this as our test place, and hopefully we will also migrate over to Political Theology Matters website at some point to provide more services to our public theologians out there in Province 5 and other places. So if you're interested, please put it in the chat box, and please indicate in the chat box that you're interested. Heather's going to put the link in there. And also, I have a very big favor. We've created a short survey. It'll take you 4 minutes because I tested it. And it asks you what you're looking for, what other resources you need, and what else we can add to help you meet your mission and your call. So is that in there too now, Heather?
It'll be in the follow-up email. So.
Oh, it's going to be in the follow-up email tomorrow. It'll be in the follow-up email tomorrow. So please be sure when you open that email to look for the link. We need to hear from you. We're kind of flying the plane as we build across, and which is fine. I kind of like it that way, but I also need feedback from you all so that we can do this effectively as possible. So please do fill out the survey.
Fabulous. Anything else you'd like to add in closing, either Marcia or Alan?
I'm just delighted with this tonight. The questions were fantastic. Alan, you were awesome. See, I told you how much he knows. He knows so much, and he has so much more to teach us even. I will have a conversation with him about deeper advocacy training in future. We had 185 registrants for this series, 185. So we are pretty excited.
Yes, thank you, and just thank you for letting me be a part of this. Really grateful for all of your work and the work that lies ahead of us as well. So please don't be a stranger. Be in touch.
All right, very good.
So as the coordinator of Province 5, I'd like to just do some closing logistics. As mentioned, there'll be a follow-up email. It will have information and pieces. A lot of you are very new to my Province 5 mailing list, and so I am thrilled to have you. I would encourage you, please don't unsubscribe during October. You're going to receive like 2 emails a week because you'll get a prep that says, hey, remember you have a session tonight. And then you'll get another one that says, here are all the resources from the session we had last night. So you're going to get a lot in October. Once we hit November, we just do a monthly email. And that'll help catch you up on all of the other opportunities that are happening around the province. We have several networks that are functioning, lots of things with that. So that's my logistical thing of please don't unsubscribe yourself, because we'll keep giving you the information that you need for that. So I think that that's what I have for this evening. And I really appreciate you being here. We are very excited to be able to continue to connect one another, connect people to each other, and hopefully that this will be helpful to your ministry, however you're doing that, wherever you're ministering with and to people. So thank you so much for being here. Marcia, do you have a closing blessing?
Yes, I was wondering if Deacon Marcia is still around. Is she still with us? There she is. Do you want to dismiss us?
Oh, you mean not pray, just dismiss?
You may pray, and you may do as well, whatever you like.
Oh, let us pray. Dear Lord, help us learn and help us to be, yes, innocent as doves, but also wise as serpents. And thank you for this chance to learn. Amen.
Amen.
Now go in peace to love and serve the Lord and raise good trouble.
Thanks
Thanks
be
be
to God.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcia.